Yeah, right there. We'll begin right there. So, the home of football, Gotham and the growth of the game. The home of football, walking past the North Bank at Highbury may have been the first place I saw it, or maybe it was in association with Wembley. Recent initiatives to promote Glasgow and Sheffield make the matter one of not just civic but national pride, as the claim has become a point of contestation. But New York? Dispelling the misconception the U.S. is a latecomer to the global game may be the most urgent task for SASH. In his 1670 pamphlet, A Brief Description of New York, Daniel Denton mentions the few remaining indigenous Lenape on the island of Manhattan played football and cards. Were these games vestiges of pre-colonial culture, or were they learned from the English, whose customs they quickly adapted? If the invention of modern football begins with the invention of the modern football, Charles Goodyear deserves credit for making controlled dribbling and accurate passing a possibility. Having patented vulcanized rubber in 1844, Goodyear's footballs with air tubes were on sale at his brother-in-law George Beecher's store in Lower Manhattan as early as April 1845. Supply implies demand. If the invention of modern football, if the first modern football was sold to footballers playing in New York, where did they play? A May 1839 ordinance forbade ball play in public spaces, but what is now Midtown was still then mostly farmland, ideal for play. One space was a mile north of Beecher's store, a field nestled between vegetable gardens on Bloomingdale Road, now Broadway. It was there the St. George's Cricket Club called home, and where the first international cricket match was played against Canada in 1844. The club's initial membership was comprised of players from Sheffield and Nottingham, and by 1848, the club was composed of 67 members and 6 professionals, almost all born in England, mostly merchants and importers. But the Dragon Slayers did not just play cricket. Club members played football on Thanksgiving for a dozen years. When Fifth Avenue sliced through their field, the club relocated to Harlem on 1 May 1846, this day in 1846. So it is reasonable to conclude the football club of the same name played at the Bloomingdale pitch when Goodyear's footballs were first sold. The club was mostly upper middle class, with some well-to-do and influential members of New York's English expat scene. As such, neither the cricket nor the football club had any urgent sense of mission to proselytize or promote their sporting endeavors beyond their established community niche, which would explain why the Clipper assumed few readers would be aware of the club. As Gotham grew, the club was forced to move, even if it felt no need to grow itself. St. George's members' origins in Sheffield and Nottingham suggest ludic continuity with pre-code games played in the north of England, just as the organization of cricket played a crucial role in the development of football clubs and their governance in Britain. The notice, after a dozen years of existence, of the intention to reorganize suggests a sudden desire of the club to promote itself. This desire was reinforced by a subsequent announcement on Thanksgiving Day, confirming the linkage between the cricket and football clubs, as the St. George's moved from Harlem to the Elysian Fields in Hoboken around this time. The Elysian Fields are most famous as the birthplace of organized baseball, even if Cooperstown enjoys the claim as the game's mythical home. According to baseball historian John Thorne, by the 1830s, on summer days, nearly 20,000 New Yorkers would flock via a 15-minute ferry ride across the Hudson to proprietor John Stevens' Edenic riverfront play space. It was there in the fall of 1856 that the New York Times cricket journalist Henry Chadwick stumbled upon a game of baseball. He is now renowned as the father of baseball, the only writer enshrined in Cooperstown. Chadwick, along with the St. George's cricketers and footballers, were part of a thriving sporting scene of New Yorkers playing in New Jersey. The game notice, a pre-code footballer's identity clue. London-born Robert Outram was 26 in 1854. A lace buyer, for Lord and Taylor, there's a link to the textile industry. And as secretary of the Doric Lodge, he was likely involved in the building of New York's Masonic Hall, completed in 1875. Perhaps a transatlantic thread to those at London's Freemasons Tavern in October 1863. The laws of the game, as determined by the FA in 1863, were promoted by Henry Chadwick, the aforementioned father of baseball, publishing them in 1866 Beadle's Dime Book of Cricket and Football, and advocating the code, quote, published by Mr. Alcock, the football editor of the London Sportsman, end quote, as editor of the New York Clipper in 1872. Central Park may be considered the natural play space for sporting New Yorkers. The space for ball games was rejected by its designers in the late 1850s. In 1885, the North Meadow was opened up for cricket, then football. The first match of football played there in late October of that year saw the host Riverside FC lose to ONT of Kearny, New Jersey. Formed in 1883 by the Clark Thread Company, ONT, Our New Thread, became U.S. Soccer's first dynasty, winning the inaugural American Football Association Cup over New York FC on the 23rd of April, 1885. The host Riversides shared the home, name, and players of a recently formed cricket side that had just finished its inaugural season with 1 win and 4 losses. Indoor soccer made its debut later that year on Broadway at the Olympian Rink, a site some may identify now with the former Roseland Ballroom. Although it featured a Newark side playing Canada, the referee was Harry Manley, who played goalkeeper for the Riversides in the first football match at Central Park. He quickly emerged as a formative figure for New York soccer. Manley featured in several Riversides matches at Central Park and the Olympian Rink. By the spring of 1886, he was named secretary of the fledgling New York State Football Association as the club's reputation flourished, acquiring their own Scotch professor, J.K. Davy, from Glasgow's fabled Queen's Park that fall. But no records exist of the club beyond 1888. Manley played in goal for the Cosmopolitan Association Football Club in their first match on 4 November 1890 against Americus at the St. George Cricket Club, Hoboken. The Cosmos would represent New York in Thanksgiving contests against Philadelphia. Provoking enough interest in soccer, the baseball owners launched the short-lived ALPFC at stadia such as the Polo Grounds in 1894. The Cosmos were sometimes identified with, and sometimes as, the Staten Island Athletic Club. Manley moved to the St. George neighborhood on the northeast tip of Staten Island, commuting to his yarn importing business in Manhattan, while remaining involved in cricket and soccer circles. When the New York State Football Association was formed or reformed on February 16, 1906, Manley was elected its first president. The Corinthians visit was orchestrated in large part by Manley. Lack of cooperation from the AFA, a major impetus, and the NYSFA, breaking away to ultimately form a new national governing body to be recognized by FIFA, now known as the United States Soccer Federation. Manley is its forgotten father. New York, its birthplace and erstwhile home. Thank you. You're muted right now, Tom.
How about now? Am I good now? All right. Thank you very much, David. I will follow him as I look out at New York and here in Jersey City. So David's view of geography is a little skewed, I would say. That's that famous cover of the New Yorker, looking past this sliver of New Jersey through the flyover states and onto the Pacific Ocean. But I would argue I'm just as guilty of this, and I think many of us are guilty of this, because we're looking at what Faulkner says, our own postage stamp of soil. So today, I'm going to confess that I've started to look at other stamps of soil and new projects that I'm embarking on, the American Football Association and its history. And this comes off of the heels of releasing Soccer Town USA, a multi-year project that focused in on Kearney and how you can tell the American soccer story through the lens of one soccer town. We've had some good media coverage. Mike Watella of Soccer America wrote a very kind review. We had some young podcasters call it the best US soccer documentary ever. We appeared on their show to talk about process, but at the end they said, what's next? Is there another Soccer Town project or Soccer Towns? And I recently reached out to many of you, and we're putting together a proposal for that. But for me, it was an issue of going back to my books after that documentary was released. And I really don't like Kurt Rausch because, like a good friend, he goes, you need to look elsewhere. And Kurt is an expert on the NAFBL, knows Patterson and Newark and Fall River very well. So he said, you need to get into the newspapers in Fall River. I had kind of exclusively been looking at the Newark and New York ones. So after doing that, I put together a short book proposal just to kind of map it out. It coincided with a documentary that I had been involved in and saw about the Passaic River, following it from its origin all the way through to the Bay. And it was written, a book written by an eco-journalist, and she recreates the journey. So it got me thinking, where do you start this journey? Up in Patterson with the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution, you come down stream to Newark and Kearney, and then, you know, further out towards New York and this whole kind of soccer waterfront. And then when you look at Fall River, it's the same thing, Fall River, New Bedford. So the chronology for this project is a much shorter one than the bigger Kearney story, from when the Mills arrived to when those three childhood friends go to the World Cup together. So bound by the years 1884 to 1924. And this was kind of a manifesto I wrote early on. You can see it's dated January 10th, and it says, inspired by Kurt Rausch, I decided to start looking at newspapers through my account on newspapers.com. I did a number of searches, and when I searched American Football Association, thousands of hits came, and I was just going through them one by one. A different story emerged about this oldest governing body outside of Britain. And I think that coincides with my mentor, Dr. Clement Price, who has always told his students, myself included, to complicate the narrative. So what is the narrative about the AFA? Roger says in his unbelievable book, which I've read multiple times and marked up, the first supposedly national soccer organization. Then Wangerin picks up on that exact phrase a year later, supposedly governing the body outside the British Isles. And then Goldblatt even kind of adds something that the development of the game and its governance was in uncooperative hands. So part of the conversation that Kurt and I have, and I have with others, is the AFA as a governing body gets short-shifted. They are not receiving the respect that they deserve in birthing the game, governing the game, and advancing the game in its first 40 years. And this project hopes to complicate that narrative. And by complicating the narrative, I started to fill in the gaps of my kind of master outline, right? And I can share it with you here by date, by newspaper, by topic, and then either a quote or some information is how I organize it. And as I look over to my left here, there's a mountain of paper after these recent searches. So I started to fill in not just the Newark Sunday Call or the Newark Evening News, but the Fall River Daily Herald, the Fall River Daily News, the Patterson Call, the Philly Inquirer. So you start to get multiple views from multiple soccer towns. Because the view that we most start with comes right out of that Spalding Guide. And although I love the Spalding Guide, I think soccer historians have relied too much on it. And we now need that as a launching pad to then advance our inquiry. And here, of course, is that kind of first mention that we probably, or kind of multi-year history of the AFA. And I call it fractious because I don't have a good title yet. One has not leapt off the page, and AFA, a fractious association. But when I Googled the definition, often as students do, right? I'm looking at argumentative, scrappy, refractory, disobedient, contrary, cranky. Like, this is what's going on. So a lot of the squabbles that we see today in US soccer circles are hundreds of plus years old with the AFA, right? Protests, that's unfair, it's rigged, there's a small group of people running it. So it's an interesting way where past is prologue and the reverse of that. There's also the B story of the trophy, which I'll get to in a minute. But I'm going to start this story upriver, inspired by Mary Bruno and Patterson, the birthplace, fittingly, of the American Industrial Revolution, which brings all these immigrants over, whether they are from Macclesfield, England, like the Patterson Football Club, advertising themselves as the first association football club in the United States. Weavers, in particular, loom fixers, they came over and they formed their football club in a coffee house off the Center Street in Patterson. So it starts there with Tommy Tufnell, who is pictured in a suit off to the right as the organizer, but then it works its way down, and I find it in Kearney, and in particular with the thread workers of Clark Thread Company. You can see the correspondence there that I stumbled on at the National Soccer Archives, and it's a letter from Phil Saragusa and his partner, having found a trophy, the AFA trophy, at a flea market in Texas. They list the winners, and then they start talking about what is it? Can you send us information? And then there's correspondence, which I have not put up here, talking about numbers and would you buy it? And I didn't think that was fair to put that out in the public forum quite yet. But here's Phil. And, through Roger, of course, we got Rangers, Rovers, and Spindles, the Kearney story, the Newark story, the Fall River story, and places in between. But what's fascinating me about this trophy as this kind of B story is also the Tiffany Rovers. So Tiffany and Company had an outfit in Newark, a silversmithing operation in Newark. And I am trying to track down those team members. Were they working at the company? Did they make this trophy? Of course, they were trying to win it and play for it in 1886, 87, 88, and then they peel off in 1889. But what this trophy represents for me is not one-offs, right? This is Cup Mania. This, leads to league play. So I think it's fundamental in soccer developing in our country. And then, of course, the famous ONT FC, sponsored by Clark Thread, win this cup in 1885, 86, and 87. So part of the book's rambling is following the cup, where it goes from one place to the next. It won't be, this happened in 1885, this happened in 1886. I want it to be character driven. I want it, whether that's a field or a club or a player or an administrator. So I'm trying to find those characters to push the narrative along. And clearly the narrative goes down east up to Massachusetts and Fall River and its founding fathers. I was able to track down the gentleman in the middle of this photograph through Ancestry.com and some correspondence with his great granddaughter. Here we are coming from Lancashire, right? And Darwin and other places are mentioned. Some of the pioneers start out in Fall River and then head down to Newark. So they're kind of transatlantic transfers, if you will. And then obviously looking to improve your team, folks from Newark and Kearney try to get some Fall River players very, very early on. Also want to flesh out, you know, what these places were like. What were the people like? Their work lives, their sporting lives, of course, the religious lives. What was the town like? And I'm getting to know Fall River, although I've never been there physically. I can't wait to have this quarantine over where I can get up there, but get into the nitty gritty. And one example, very obscure, is that when they were playing games between Fall River and the Pawtucket Free Rangers, they would send homing pigeons back and forth with the score, because unlike any other soccer town that I've seen, Fall River folks love to bet on the games, right? So that homing pigeon would get home before the players would with the final score, and you could know if you won your bet or not. And then when you go down that rabbit hole, or pigeonhole, pun intended, you find out that Fall River is one of the homes of the Homing Pigeon Association. Two of the national officers are from Fall River. So, you know, these are the kind of the connections you try to make through the newspapers, through ancestry, through relatives, and that's what I'm looking to do. This is the first of its kind for SASH. I was corresponding with Peter Alleghi of the Football Scholars Forum last night. I'm saying, we're copying you. And apparently there are 3 or 4 other bodies that are doing this type of stuff, virtual meeting, Zoom calls. And we did one, a joint sponsorship between SASH and the Football Scholars Forum. And the English game, all these things I'm talking about, we're kind of jumping out of that and asking me questions, asking us questions on early American soccer. So certainly themes of class, the professionalism, amateurism, gender, regionalism, right? Fall River versus Newark, Patterson hates Newark, all this kind of fractious behavior going on. And one of the key characters is from Fall River initially, Bolton, Fall River, Kearney, and he wins the trophy 3 times in a row. 85, 86, 87, competition goes up to Fall River. He's back and forth playing against his old friends. And then as a bar owner, kind of older player, he wins the cup again in 1898, player coach. And then that's when the competition goes defunct for the first time. It goes defunct twice, right? They don't play for it from 1899 to 1905. He donates the trophy back. And what I've been able to dig up is he must have fallen on some rough times because he pawned it and then went back to get it at a Newark pawn shop and then gifted it back to the AFA. And that's the trophy many of us got to handle at Frisco. And he had it in his bar. Often players, whether it's Dennis Shea, who Brian Bunk will talk about next, and others, you know, this have a bar, have a business, have a restaurant after your playing career or in conjunction with your playing career. So the AFA story I will pick up in 1906 after this interlude and bring it through even more contentious years because it is no longer the big organization trying to govern soccer. Through the Progressive Era movement, I would argue there are calls for a truly national organization, and it replaces the AFA, and that is U.S. Soccer, formed in 1913 at the Astor Hotel, connecting with David back to the home of football, New York City. Thank you. Introduce Brian Bunk, and I spent many hours with Brian over the last week or so. not on a Zoom call, not emailing. I got the privilege and honor of reading his manuscripts on early American soccer. So the manuscript has arrived back at his home in Massachusetts. Hopefully can read all my marginalia and questions and comments, but that is going to be a real addition to the scholarship, the historiography. So Brian teaches at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Among courses, he teaches the global history of soccer. And this story that he's about to talk about comes out of that manuscript. Brian.
Thanks, Tom. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So what I decided to do was to do one of these presentations where it's 20 seconds, 20 slides, 20 seconds. So once Tom hits the beginning button, it should go pretty quickly. And I realized this is the first time I've ever done this kind of a presentation, and it's actually really hard to come up with communicable information in 20-second bites. So, you know, if anything's unclear, if I go really quickly, let me know at the end, and I'm happy to answer any sort of questions. So Tom, if you want to hit the start button, it should automatically advance every 20 seconds. Okay, last summer, I began a project to create a database of athletes who played in the professional leagues in 1894. It includes information on players from both the American League of Professional Football and the American Association of Professional Football. The data is based on my own research, as well as the work of the folks listed here, and of course others. I'm going to explain how I gathered the data and some interesting trends. The database contains basic information like names, team, appearances, goals, etc., but also birth date, birthplace, physical descriptions, and general notes. Currently, there are 140 players in total, with birthplace records for 66 and birth date information on 60. Much of the information comes from newspapers like this one. These can be frustrating in that they often only include surnames. Sometimes the surnames are spelled differently depending on the newspaper. I made the spellings consistent by using either common sense or the hometown paper. This is obviously not perfect and could introduce errors into the database. Some detailed team reports do exist, and they include a wealth of information about the players. This is the richest form of data, but also the most unusual, and so we only have heights and weights for just over a third of the entries and detailed notes on about a quarter of them. It likely skews some of the other numbers around age and country or state of origin that I'll talk about a little bit later. I searched previous seasons in order to identify players. Success often depended on how many newspapers from a particular city have been digitized. This research worked best for less common surnames where it was unlikely there would be multiple soccer players with the same unusual last name. It did not work trying to identify a Connolly who played in New York. Just as an example, Baltimore was organized by A.W. Stewart, and he brought 3 Mackendrick brothers with him from Detroit. 6 came from England, leaving a forward named Barkey unidentified. A report from summer 1894 indicated that he played with John Mackendrick for Toronto Scots. Canadian census records indicate that there were 2 brothers named Barkey, so his first name could either be Fred or George. Once I had a surname and first name or initial, I used FamilySearch.org, which is free, and Ancestry.com to look for men of the right age who lived in soccer-playing communities. Again, this was most useful for the less common names. The records often revealed the year and place of birth, although depending on the source, it might only include the country or the state. Another method was to look for obituaries. Often I had to guess about who a player might have been using very few sources of evidence. Take the case of Trenton. For a long time, all I had for most of the squad were last names taken from box scores. One of these names was Cooper, no first name or initial. After the demise of the AAPF, some players in the city reformed a local soccer team. 2 of them matched players from the Trenton squad, and one of them was named Fred Cooper. He was born in England, and his obituary described him as an avid soccer player in his youth. Am I 100% sure Fred Cooper played for Trenton in 1894? No, but the evidence is pretty convincing. Data on birthplace is not complete, but some interesting trends emerge. we have information on about half of the total. 26 were born in England, the highest of any single country. 19 were from Scotland, and I expected more to be from Scotland given the predominance of Scots in many football communities around the country. Native-born players made up almost 30% of those with identified birthplaces. Not surprising, given the prevalence and press coverage of the Fall River players, Massachusetts was the top state, New Jersey was second, and Rhode Island third. No player born in New York or Pennsylvania have been conclusively identified, which is surprising given the long history of the sport in those areas, as David just indicated, I guess, today. The median age of the men was 24, and the oldest 34, and the youngest 18. The median height was 5'8", and the average weight was 152 pounds. The average size of native-born men in 1890 was 5'6", 176 pounds. The players were generally taller and leaner, which makes sense for professional athletes. Just some information about individual players. Goalkeeper Dennis Shea toured Great Britain in 1891 and won the American Cup with Pawtucket in 1893. Robert Wasson played for Philadelphia in the AAPF and captured the American Cup 2 years running with Patterson True Blues in 1896 and Mans in 1897. John Mackendrick was called one of the finest players who ever stepped on a football field. At 5'10", 175 pounds, he was the largest player in both leagues, likely because he was a stone cutter by trade. His younger brother James was called a star of the first magnitude and scored at least 4 goals in 2 league matches. Ralph Hall, tall and thin at 5'10", 156 pounds, was also part of Patterson's 1896 American Cup winning side. Robert Pickup was a playmaking midfielder from Fall River who used excellent judgment in placing the ball and in feeding the forward. He had also mastered the art of kicking, an important skill in soccer. John Pemberton scored 6 goals in 5 matches, earning him a share of the Golden Boot. Theodore Mckenzie was a tricky winger with perfect control of the ball. William Morton stood 5'10" and weighed 168 pounds, and one report praised his great strength and powers of endurance, along with his judgment and coolness in emergencies. William the Kid Bannister was the smallest, just 5'2", 113 pounds. Still, he was described as the hardest player on the team, and it takes some tall hustling to dodge him. He scored 6 and 6 to share top honors with Pemberton. The Kid was 20 when he started in the ALPF and died just 6 years later of dysentery while serving with the U.S. Army in the Philippines. Who was the first to score in the U.S. professional leagues? Initially, I thought it was New York's William Lupton, although thanks to this confusing box score, others argued for Connolly. However, it was most likely Albert Jenkins of Brooklyn who scored the first goal in the ALPF against Boston on October 6, 1894. The AAPF kicked off earlier, so the first openly professional goal scorer had to come from that league. September 29th, 1894 featured 2 games, Philadelphia versus Trenton and Newark versus Patterson. No match report for the second game has been found. Based on reports from the other match, Charles Sudell scored the first documented goal in U.S. professional soccer history. Here's the link to the database, and as you can see, it's currently available on my website under the Resources tab on the home page. Please feel free to send me any corrections or additions. And I now have access to Ancestry.com at home, which is new. Usually we only have access on campus. So I'm trying to update and add as much information as possible. So that process will continue over time. Thanks.
Well done. So now we will go to our final presentation, and that is a father-son duo. James Brown, the vice president of our society, will bring his father through 10 images that were selected to talk about his soccer journey, his soccer odyssey. It's something that we did with great success at the USC convention in Baltimore in January with Arnie Ramirez. So wonderful idea from David. We will continue this series. This is your Soccer Life series with Hall of Famer George Brown and his son, James.
Thank you so much, Tom. I appreciate it. It's great to see everybody here. This is a great first virtual conference. Yeah, I've had the pleasure since at least 5 to 6 years to be working on a daily basis, exchanging with my father on all areas of our family history, but also about American soccer history. And I thought that this was a fantastic idea to go through our archives, pick out some great pictures that span his lifetime. And it's fantastic to see these, the little memories that will come of, from first seeing these pictures. So thank you very much for being with us. Dad, if you can unmute your microphone.
Done.
Okay. There you go. Now here's the first slides, and you're off.
Yeah, thank you. It seemed like a simple exercise at first, but typical son James, he downplayed what was involved. So you have to bear with me. I have some interesting photographs, and it was my understanding, it was my understanding that I had approximately a minute to kind of bring up memories of each photograph. So I'll do my best. And when I get to issues such as the Hall of Fame, fortunately, I see that Jack Huckle is online, and he can correct me wherever I go wrong. This first image, that's my father and I. We emigrated in 1948 to Greenwich. I was 13 years old. I couldn't play baseball or basketball or football. And so my father was kind of an entrepreneur. So he decided that I had to be able to play something other than high school soccer. So he revived the Connecticut League. He ended up he started as the president. Then he formed a soccer team called Greenport United, and that's our uniforms that you can see. He played with me. He was inside right, I was outside right. He would be in his 40s then, I would be probably 15. And I scored a bundle of goals in the league, most of them from his passes because he was head and shoulders above the players who were in that league. The local papers called me the Mighty Mite. I was probably about 5'2", maybe weighed 110 pounds. If you look at the photograph, it's unfortunate it doesn't go all the way down, but we played with the heavy leather boots with a hard toe, and my father was wise enough to insert in under my shin pads an inch-thick wad of foam rubber, hard foam rubber. And I really needed that because the other players found that the best way to stop me was to kick me. And so I survived. Oh, why did you switch the photograph?
Because it was more than 1 minute, but we can go back.
Oh yeah, please do, because I'm off and on. Some are a minute, some are a little bit more. Anyway, a brief anecdote. My father was concerned with the roughness of the play. He called a meeting of the referees and he instructed them to clamp down on offenders. And the following week, he got in a fight on the field and he was the first one ejected based on his instructions. Oh, okay, next one. This is a shot of me with Colin Jost on the left and Roger Holloway on the right. Colin and Roger literally saved the history of American soccer. They researched, organized, and documented it. Colin, of course, had an extensive library. Roger was initially just a soccer buff. He worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he became the go-to guy on anything related to soccer. Now, and he and Colin wrote the Encyclopedia of American Soccer, which was the first carefully researched book of its kind. Roger did most of the writing. He subsequently wrote several books on soccer in America, excellent books. When the new hall was completed in 1999, they physically organized the archives. It was a huge open space in the back of the hall, probably half the length of a football field, and loaded with a bunch of boxes. And they physically organized the archives so that serious researchers could access the collections. It was a gargantuan task. Colin was the official Hall of Fame historian, and upon his retirement, he was succeeded by Roger. And although Roger is no longer the Hall historian, he continues to maintain the records of US soccer players and verifies their eligibility for Hall of Fame consideration. Next slide, please. This is the Greenwich High School soccer team. This is probably around 1951, and you can see me on the far right. As you can see, I'm probably at that time about 2 feet shorter than most of the big players on the team. I'd be about 14 at the time. And the state of soccer then was just appalling, especially high school soccer. We played with rubber composition balls. My father ended up coaching in my junior and senior year, and I scored most of the goals for the team. And it was at the time when he was coaching the team, I had my one and only conflict with my father. We had an undefeated season. I scored 8 goals out of the 10 for the team. I assisted on the other 2, and he was quoted in the newspaper as saying, the team had no single outstanding player. I took exception. It didn't make any difference. Okay, next slide, please. This is the US versus Mexico. It was 1957. It was my one and only cap. The US organization was ludicrous. We arrived at the airport on the Friday night around midnight. The following day, we were taken out to the field and we practiced at noontime at the heat of the height of the sun. They had 2 balls at the practice, and it was just kind of a kick in to the goals. We went sightseeing after the practice. I have yet to be introduced to 3 of the players on the team, believe it or not. The game was appalling. We lost 6-0. There were about 75,000 spectators who spent most of their time whistling, which is a well-known form of disapproval. It was the worst game I ever played, and I literally kicked the ball perhaps twice. The photo shows the only real action I was involved in. It was a long ball. It was punted up the field through the middle. I was going like the hammers of hell. It was a race between Carvajal and me. Carvajal was the goalie, the Mexican goalie who actually played in 4 World Cups. As you can see from the photograph, Carvajal won. He knocked me out. Next slide, please. This is a press conference in LA. It was the official announcement of the 2007 induction of Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy, who are absolutely wonderful, soon-to-be Hall of Famers. I was there because we were seeking a replacement for the Hall of Fame president. That position had been held for a number of years by Will Lunn. I agreed to serve on a volunteer basis as the president, the interim president, while the search was on. During that year, I managed to land the Century Council as a sponsor, and they had a program called Girl Talk, and it was the organization basically was in support of no overuse of alcohol. It was a fine organization. Their sponsorship amounted to $500,000 spread out over a 5-year period. And they also subsidized the full induction ceremony. It was first class. And that was estimated to be around $250,000. It was, by all accounts, the most successful induction in Hall history. It was somewhat ironic that I worked my butt off for a year putting all the pieces in place, and then approximately 6 weeks before the actual induction, they hired a new president who stood up on the stage and got all the credit. But that's life. Next slide, please. This was an interesting event. It was held in 1957. It was in Ebbets Field. It was a fundraiser for Israel. And I was on the ASL All-Star team, and we played Hapoel. We lost 6-4, but happily, at least I scored one of the goals for the All-Stars. The stadium was sold out, and Ebbets Field held about 35,000 at the time. Marilyn Monroe was married to Arthur Miller, who was a strong supporter of Israel causes. And so he brought along his wife at the time, Marilyn, and she did the ceremonial kickoff. She wore a very tight skirt, and her décolletage went forever. And in fact, it was so extreme that somebody had her place a flower in her bosom. So when she went to kick the ball off, the photographers got down on the ground with their box cameras, and she walked up to the ball and gave it a very dainty kick. And one of the photographers kind of raised up off the ground, and he said, in typical New York language, he said, "Hey, Marilyn, give us a break." So she retakes the kick. This time she hikes up her skirt, shows lots of leg. There was lots of loft on the kick. She satisfied the photographers, and it made all the papers in New York, and frankly, across the nation. Good memory. Next slide, please. This is the German-Hungarians in around 1955. I played with them for 3 years. They were known as the Knitters because the team sponsor owned, his name was Nick Muller. Nick Muller. He owned knitting mills. And Clarkie Souza, another Hall of Famer, actually worked for Nick in the knitting mills. They played in Metropolitan Oval. That's where this shot was taken. It was in Brooklyn. There wasn't a blade of grass at the time. There were chain link nets. There's iron railings around the field that were about 3 feet from the sidelines. It was very dangerous. The Hungarians won. We won 3 years in a row. We actually went undefeated one season. I was outside right, and Clarkie Souza was inside right. I was league MVP in '53, and I played in every All-Star game. And invariably, Clarkie was on the team with me. I actually left the German-Hungarians because of Clarkie Souza. He loved to dribble. He was superb. He liked short passes. I was exactly the opposite. I was a straight ahead player. I liked long through balls. I would go for the goal. I would shoot at every opportunity. And I was just not compatible with Clarkie. So I finally got bored. And after 3 years, I jumped to the American Soccer League. As a side note, Clarkie Sousa was one of the few players who could have played then in European football and today in European football. His control was brilliant, and he shielded the ball. You couldn't get near the ball when he was on it. He was a perfect gentleman, both on and off the field. But he and I, we couldn't survive together. All right, my next slide, please. This is the Inwood Forest Dads Club. It would be around 1973. It was in Houston, Texas. And Peg and I had just come back from Libya, where we had been caught in Gaddafi's revolution. There was a knock on the door one night. I opened the door, and there's this overweight, bearded fella with an artificial leg who informs me that he's a goalkeeper. And he needed help in forming a soccer program for the Dads Club. And they only had 2 sports at the time. It was baseball and football. So I helped him put a program together. We pulled in 5 or 6 fellas with foreign accents. There was an Englishman, a Dane, a Spaniard, and the assumption made by everyone was that because they had a foreign accent, they were knowledgeable about soccer. It wasn't true, but it worked. So I ended up coaching. I taught coaches and referees. I also coached the team and refereed games. And the first year there was about 80 players. The second year, 300 players. The third year, 700 players. And it became the dominant sport in the Dads Club. So it was a success story. That's good. This is the Joy Fawcett induction, and it was the group shot that we always took at the Liars Retreat. Peg and I hosted that annually. It was part of the Hall of Fame inductions, and the general rule was players only, no press or hall officials. Joyce was an absolute joy. Her induction in 2009, she had over 200 caps, incredible. It's so sad that if you look over the people in this shot, on the far left is Walter Barr. He's now passed. On the far right is Harry Keogh. He's passed. Standing next to him is Chico Chikurian. He's passed. And my dearest friend, Jean Olaf, is sitting behind the banner with Joy Fawcett. This Liars Retreat actually started out as just Walter Barr, Jackie Hines, and Jean Olaf, who would come to my house, and I'd put them up, and I'd feed and water them, and we'd tell stories. And it grew more and more each year, and finally we formalized it, and it became a real centerpiece of the Hall of Fame weekend. At one point, there was one induction when we had actually 20 Hall of Famers who attended the Liars Retreat. The key rule there was that no one could question any Hall of Famers' stories. If they did, they got thrown out. Colin Jost and Roger Alloway were the monitors, and they would clarify any questionable stories, but they were the only ones that could comment at all. Sad that when I left the hall, it was no longer held. Next slide, please. This is my father and his namesake, my son James, who's on this call. Now, Jim was a dead ringer from my father in his youth. And that shot of him sitting on the bed and going over memorabilia was absolutely typical. Jim was very close to his grandfather. He'd listen to his story for hours. And that probably was the driving force behind his interest in soccer research and his ultimately being elected as vice president of SASH. My father would drive down to New Jersey to watch every game when Jim was playing for Scotch Plains. And Jim was thrilled when my father was inducted into the hall in 1986. But a sidebar story is that the night before the induction, my father met up with Arnie Oliver, the only other surviving member of the 1930 World Cup team. And they had not seen each other since 1930. Unfortunately, they celebrated too much. My father could not get out of bed the next day, so I had to accept the Hall of Fame recognition on his behalf. All right, next slide, please. This is my dear wife, Peggy. She passed away in 2018. She was the archive manager for close to 10 years, and she personally inventoried every collection in the hall archives. She painstakingly listed in longhand every item in every box, and she spent untold hours photocopying reams of publications like the ASL News, so that the originals could be preserved and researchers could work with the copies. I had the pleasure of typing all of her longhand inventories, and they turned out to be quite valuable because the collections are now sitting in a warehouse in North Carolina, but using that inventory that Peg so painstakingly put together, they can actually go to these indexed boxes and identify specific objects. So in addition to Peg's duties as the archive manager, she hosted both Roger and Colin, who would stay at our house when they were working at the hall. Roger used to come down about 3 or 4 times a year from Philly. And Colin was down, he'd be down there 7 or 8 times. And they'd stay at our house and eat my famous meatloaf. And that's the end of my presentation, Tom. And I thank you all.
Wonderful. Just, proof that the American soccer story is the generational story, right? It's a family story. So thank you very much for sharing and adding to that series that we're beginning that series that we hope to continue to add to. Just a great way of talking about a very rich soccer and family life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciated the opportunity, and I apologize for going under and over the 1-minute mark. But that's life. You have to live with it.
You were grandfathered for sure. Don't worry about it.
Okay,
so
thank you.
I think now we can open up the floor to any questions, observations, comments. Please unmute yourself and add anything that you'd like to add.
Well, I just wanted to kind of add on to the importance of this oral legacy, really taking time with people like my dad who have had this rich soccer past, this rich connection with US soccer history. We need to do more in documenting, in a videotaping, or just recording, whether it's in a podcast or whether it's a videoed session, a recorded session, because these things reveal so many new memories just showing a picture. And, we could have talked about the subject maybe 10 times over the past year. But when you finally show that picture and it sparks new ideas, new thoughts, things you just didn't remember, those are things that are so important. And we need to do a really good job of finding the people who are really going to be able to enrich what we're doing. We're doing a fantastic job. We need to build on that. So thank you, Dad, for contributing to this.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And by the way, I can't stress enough the value of the work that Roger Holloway and Colin Jost did. They literally salvaged the American soccer history. It deserves more than my 1 minute. They're remarkable individuals. And by the way, SASH, as you may recall, for a number of years consisted of Roger and Colin. And it's so good to see a revival of SASH and so many really respected researchers. I'm very impressed, Tom, and thank you very much for allowing me to play a part. And if you'll forgive me now, I'm going to have to leave your meeting. I have work to do and a cat to feed.
Thank you, George.
Thank you. See you, James.
Okay, take care, Dad.
Any other comments on what we've done? Questions for the presenters? We can speak now, or we can communicate via social media or email or text.
Tom, I'd love to throw a question out to David. David, you're still here, right? Because my screen doesn't go all the way down. Yeah, there you are.
Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating stuff. Thank you. I was wondering on your work specifically on this guy Robert Outram, which was very interesting to see that he was involved in this in potentially as a Freemason. So I was kind of curious to pick your brain a little bit about that, and as well if you would ever come across anything about a William Campbell, who later on obviously is very very involved in the New York State Association right before the USFA in 1913. But William Campbell is this guy that then continues to appear, especially in the international scene over the next 20, 30 years. And I was curious if you or if anybody else had come across a William Campbell, potentially a businessman, maybe living between Havana, Cuba and New York and involved in soccer as well.
I've seen the name listed there, but I haven't done any research into it, and certainly especially find it interesting now as some of us are a little more pursuing the Scotch professor angle. So Campbell's background is a Scot, I would assume, on the basis of his surname. You never know. But no, the short answer is no, I haven't done anything on him. But as for the Freemason connection, there is a Freemasons lodge, or excuse me, a football lodge now in England, and they're doing a lot of research in this area. They're really not necessarily sharing it with the public, maybe as much as hopefully they will in the future. But I think that's a really important thread. We talk, pun intended here, right? We talk about the impact of the textile industry, and I thought that was pretty interesting to hear that about the German Hungarians just now. I was pretty shocked by that linkage, but of course ONT and Fall River and in northern New Jersey, the emphasis on the textile industry. But one thing I was trying to tease out is that, whether it was Manley and his yarn importing, or Outram and the lace that he would obtain for Lord and Taylor, the threads are there. But I think the Masonic threads are there as well. And I think that's another place that people can be looking to as we try to figure out more about these people. Were they involved with Masonic lodges? Because just like cricket clubs, Masonic lodges kind of were great training grounds for, organized leadership.
I'm going to add one thing. While David was speaking, I pulled up some correspondence that he and I had about an AFA officer that I had seen over and over and over again. I think one of the first families to the Newark area, the Hood family, and Thomas B. Hood, according to the proceedings of the Grand Lodge of the Free and Accepted Masons in 1911, where he was an officer in the Kearney Lodge at Johnston Ave and John Street, and also the organist. They met on Thursdays. He was also one of the initial officers in the AFA, served as vice president 84 through 86, and then secretary from 86 to 88, was a member of Knox Presbyterian, the old Presbyterian church, singer, organist, amateur actor, involved in the whole muscular Christianity movement. So, I sent that to Dave and he goes, there you go. And then now we have kind of some of the Scotch professor connections, the Presbyterian connections, because in Kearney and these other places, you'll have kind of both strands, right? You'll have, that kind of, if you will, Celtic Rangers approach to the Scottish community.
Thanks, Tom.
I also have a question for David. I know you and I have talked about this a little bit because we stumbled into these things. I stumbled into it when I was doing research, and you've mentioned it here. Has anyone ever done anything expansive on the relationship between soccer and cricket in the 19th century? Because I find that really curious, and it's especially interesting as we're talking about sports that struggled to gain a foothold. Soccer certainly did better than cricket did.
Yeah, Tony Collins mentions it in one or two sentences in his book, How Football Began. But I can't remember if you were in Atlanta. I know a few other people on the call were in Atlanta when I was talking about the Cosmopolitan Association Football Club, and how I just kind of stumbled on finding out so much more about some of these New York footballers by looking in the rosters of cricket match reports. And again, you see this in, I mentioned Chadwick. Chadwick was originally a cricket reporter and then gets involved in baseball. And Arthur Spalding had his archives. His archives are now at the New York Public Library, but there are huge gaps in what should be the archive. John Thorne, the baseball historian, and I have talked about this a lot. I kind of think Spalding almost hid this stuff. You can't find massive. So for instance, October 1894 would be one space you really want to see what he had in his diaries, and they're just not there. Same too with his following of cricket. He didn't just abandon cricket. So the relationship between cricket and soccer, but I would say this, Bo, and I sorry if my thoughts on this are a little bit jumbled, but I get really excited about this now. And I know Steve Holroyd started to become a student of cricket too, of late. But the elitism that you find in some of the cricket clubs, where they felt no need to proselytize, that was manifest in something like, Manley, I don't think really saw his task with the New York State Football Association as trying to necessarily grow the game. I think, it was more emphasis on the players, and if people showed up, again, maybe I'm kind of overstating that a little bit, but I think the cricket community didn't really see the need to grow, and the baseball community really took off thriving. And I think maybe the alignment of soccer with cricket, I think there's something to be said for that. So I think you'll find that a lot of the names that, say, Brian was identifying, I would not be the least bit surprised if a sizable percentage of those people that he's found all that data on, I'd actually be pretty shocked if there wasn't a good amount of them that appear in cricket lineups as well.
And that's this whole class argument that comes out of the English game, right? I stumbled on this morning when I was prepping some things from David Goldblatt. Excluded from the universities and a failure in the marketplace, football survived in the street and in the neighborhoods where a new wave of British immigrants had settled. Football or soccer was particularly strong in small industrial towns of New England and the East Coast. So this, I think, some of us are working on this issue of class, right? And kind of the cricket, field club scene is more that middle and upper, echelon. And then, these working class folks attached to the thread mills, right?
There's that, for what it's worth, and I've only just begun scratching the surface, but besides class, interestingly, in Philadelphia, which remains, I guess, the capital for cricket in this country, such as it is, it really was a function of space. Baseball, you didn't require as big a field to play baseball. Cricket, it required a lot more space, and of course, the only places that saved and kept up those type of spaces were the country clubs, what would become the country clubs. As opposed to baseball, it was easier to play baseball on a rougher surface. While class was certainly a big part of it, we've seen that time and again. It turns out a lot of it, at least around here, was a function of real estate.
And also they have that great collection at Haverford College, right?
Yep.
Maybe I'll just add one thing on cricket for anybody who's near Boston. James Lovett, so Jim DeWolf Lovett, one of the old Oneida, old Boston boys. There is a lovely section of his personal scrapbook that's in I can't remember if it's the Bostonian Society or the Boston Athenaeum or the Massachusetts Historical Society, one of those three. I can look it up if anybody's interested, send me afterwards. But he deposited a wonderful scrapbook of several hundred pages of material that I used quite a lot for some of my Oneida research. And in there, remember he's born in 44, 46, I think, 1844, 46, 45. And he was a huge cricket fan, played significantly all the way up into the late 1860s. There's wonderful material there's more stuff on his baseball, because he then shifted into baseball and became far more interested in baseball than he was actually in football, which is even better. But if anybody wants material there, let me know and I can figure out which society it was. But there's a nice little collection of stuff, a couple tidbits.
I have a couple of points, if I may, real quick. Dave, I was also struck by the cricket club connection as well. And to answer Bo's question, I think the sport history in the United States has also has often seen the cricket clubs, the narrative going into baseball clubs. But what we all have discovered is that this was an incubator for U.S. soccer. And that's just more information for us to work with, what Dave found. My second point is a question for Brian. Fascinating research on your work. And I was, for better or worse, I'm now involved in researching Detroit soccer. And I was struck by that picture you had of the Detroit Football Club. And you highlighted Stewart and the Mackendrick brothers. And Brian, I was wondering if you could kind of speak a little bit to how they ended up kicking out on the East Coast and what that journey was like, if you have any additional information on those people.
Well, I mean, the Mackendrick brothers were originally based out of the Twin Cities, and they played soccer there in St. Paul, and then they relocated to Detroit. And I mean, I'm not sure how A.W. Stewart got in charge of the Baltimore squad, but he was the one who recruited the Mackendricks and possibly the English players. That's an open question. But I don't know. I mean, Stewart seems to be the key to bringing those guys to Baltimore for the professional league in 1894. But they had played, as you probably know, had played for years in Canada and in Detroit, around that area. But I don't have any information about where they went or what happened to them after 1894, unfortunately.
If I find anything, I'll keep you posted. Thank you for for noticing them. That's all I had.
We are coming up on 90 minutes appropriately. We can end before that, but anybody else with comments, observations, questions?
Yes, if I may, I just joined your society a couple of days ago, and unfortunately I don't have anything to say about the relationship between cricket and soccer in the US because I'm from Canada. But I've been working on the history, the pioneer days of history, pioneer days of soccer in St. John's in Newfoundland. And here the relationship between the two sports was very, very close. At the beginning, there was only cricket. Cricket comes around in the 1820s. But in the 70s and 80s, the two overlap. And most soccer players are also cricket players. And sometime later on also play rugby, and it's a whole athlete that is able to play different sports. But eventually soccer wins. By the turn of the century, cricket has disappeared from the city, and there were a very large number of clubs for in a place of 25,000 people at the time. The reason, at least the cricket fans at the time were lamenting the passing of cricket was that you couldn't go to a cricket game because you didn't know how long you had to be there. Whereas a soccer game, you went and it was 90 minutes and that was it. But by the turn of the century, cricket has disappeared.
And let me introduce you to one of our newest members, or perhaps our newest member, as Waldo Croce, doing all sorts of great work up in Canada. He wrote an article on the 1950 World Cup match between the US and England. I think we all remember that result. But it was a linguistic, almost lost in translation story between the Italian referee and the Italian-American center back from St. Louis, Charlie Colombo. So thank you for joining us. And that article will be repurposed and appear on the site soon. Ed Farnsworth will get that up so we can all read about his contribution to the historiography. Thanks for joining.
Thank you to all of you. It's a pleasure for me to be among you.
All right. Well, we are going to finish. Oh, go ahead, Kevin. Go.
I was just going to throw one last question to Brian, because I thought the little anecdote about the size and weight of players was really fascinating. And did I hear you right that you said the average height for the players? That's an interesting sample because that's 60 some players, which is pretty. That's a lot of people. Was it 5'6"? And if yes, did you look at that at all with respect to the size, average height of the rest of the population? I'm just curious if there was differences, given that the players there, you mentioned a lot are immigrants from England, Scotland. Is there any difference? I was curious. The reason I ask is because Manning, our dear friend Gustav Manning, his nickname was Little Man in about when he was serving in the First World War, and he was, as far as I understand, 5'8" or 5'10", and he was considered Little Man. So I was just curious about the height for these guys, if you had any other.
Yeah, there's not a lot of information, as I mentioned. I can't remember exactly how much, maybe only a quarter or maybe a third. So it's hard to make generalizations, I guess. I calculated the median height, which was 5'8", and the average weight was 152 pounds. And the closest I could come, or I didn't spend a lot of time searching, but I looked through the statistical history of the United States, and I found the closest match was the average size of native-born men in 1890, so a little bit earlier, and that was 5'6", 176 pounds. So the players were actually taller on average, I guess, based on the limited sample size than than the average American male was around that same time. So yeah, I was curious about that too, whether the immigrants, I don't know what the average, height and weight of a man was in England or Scotland or something around the same time. It was probably pretty similar, I would guess. But yeah, so they were generally bigger, I think, all around. Slimmer, probably, but that sort of makes sense. I mean, I should say there was another player who was 200 pounds, but I didn't have a height for him. And they described him as a fat-bodied man. So maybe Mackendrick wasn't the heaviest player in the league, but he was certainly the tallest and the heaviest,
Thanks, Brian.
All right, why don't we wrap up there, and if I can make another call, if you're not a member, please find us on the SASH website. There's some great resources on that website. Look for more communication from us in terms of an upcoming newsletter, as well as notification of the June 5th, 1 o'clock, kind of session 2 of the symposium, because the symposium was designed to have 3 different sessions, some social activities, even a Major League Soccer game. Obviously, we were not able to do any of those things. So we'll have session 2, and the executive committee has talked about extending these Zoom calls into the summer, and then a break, and then continue in the fall. So hopefully this is the first of many hour to 90-minute sessions about American soccer history, our research, and I wrote down the 3 C's as I was watching, participating, and listening. I mean, for me, it's all about kind of the collegiality and the collaboration and the community that we're building. So thank you to all you as we're quarantining and isolating with our own books and our own ideas. It's great to join as a community, come together, and enjoy each other's company. So happy Friday, have a good weekend, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. And don't hesitate to use Zoom if anybody wants to work to flesh out some ideas. You got a topic that you're working on, and you want to run it by somebody else. We can do these informal sessions.
Thanks. Bye.